Welcome to American History Lesson number 4, where we're going to talk about the New England colonies. I'm going to specifically focus on two of them, but we'll do a bit of an overview as well. So here's where I'm talking about when I mention the New England colonies. So New Hampshire was actually the first of the New England colonies when we think of like a fully fleshed out colony. We're not talking about New Hampshire today, though. They're historically not as important as the Massachusetts colonies are. So there's two main colonies that will eventually merge to be Massachusetts. We're going to be looking mainly at them in this lesson. But Massachusetts as a colony is basically 1630, but you'll notice the little asterisk. That's because one colony came earlier that became part of Massachusetts. And as you can see from the map, Massachusetts originally claimed Maine as part of their territory. Rhode Island came 6 years after Massachusetts, and Connecticut that same year. So they all got settled pretty close in time to one another. Now, as for who was here first, these are the Native American nations that were here when the settlers came over from England. So they would have encountered like the Wampanoags and the Massachusetts. Massachusetts people are where we get the name for the colony and later state of Massachusetts. Another group that was fairly significant was the Narragansetts, who were down in Rhode Island. They're significant because they weren't particularly friendly. Now, the story of New England is very much the story of separatists versus Puritans. Two different groups that you should be aware of, and I will tell you how they differ in just a minute. Now, first, where do these people come from? They come from England, and if you look at the areas in the dark green, that's where the bulk of them are coming from. So if you trace your ancestry back to the Mayflower or back to Massachusetts Bay, this is where your ancestors probably come from. So what did the Puritans believe? The Puritans, first off, were Calvinists. They were influenced by the reformer John Calvin. And so they had a lot of theology in common with today's Calvinists. But if you're not really familiar with theology, here's a few important things you should know about their beliefs. First of all, they believed in predestination. So this is an idea that God has chosen ahead of time, before anybody was even born, exactly who he's going to save, exactly who gets to go to heaven. Nothing you do in this life will influence that decision at all. You have to have been chosen before you were even born. That's an important belief of theirs. Along with that, because of predestination, good works, no matter how good you are, cannot save you if you're predestined for hell. And you can't know who's predestined for hell. So you can probably already see where these people would have a lot of insecurity about their eternal souls, right? Along with this, because of this belief in predestination, they believed that nobody could be 100% certain of their spiritual status. So if you look at the writings of the Puritans, it's very clear these were people under a lot of stress because they were constantly worried over whether or not they were actually going to heaven. And nothing that they did in this life could influence that decision. But because of those gnawing doubts, they were constantly looking for signs of conversion in themselves and one another in the form of good works and following the rules. So if somebody stepped out of line, they would immediately assume that person can't possibly be saved because they did this wrong thing, and we probably should stay away from that person because they could corrupt us. Now, why were they called Puritans? They were called Puritans because they wanted to completely reform, or in other words, purify, the Church of England. They didn't want to leave the Church of England. They just wanted to fix it. A lot of other people in the Church of England, however, didn't think it needed to be fixed, so there was tension. Well, the Puritans grew very impatient with the slow process of the Protestant Reformation back in England. They felt like the reforms that they wanted in the church were not happening fast enough, and that the Church of England was way too similar to the Catholic Church. So this leads to them eventually deciding to leave. Something else you should know about the Puritans, they abolished Christmas. They believed that the holiday was pure vanity and vice. Father Christmas, which was like an early prototype of Santa Claus, misled children, and they saw this as a completely evil, unnecessary holiday. So in Puritan areas, Christmas was illegal. Now we talk about the separatists. So the separatists actually are Puritans. They agree with the Puritans on theology, they just take things further. So technically, again, they are Puritans. You can just think of them as a more fundamentalist or extremist branch. They split off from the rest of the Puritans because they decided the church cannot be saved, we have to make a new one. The separatists believed that only visible saints, so those who could demonstrate in front of their fellow Puritans that they were part of the elect that were going to heaven, and the way that you would demonstrate that is by being very, very good, following all the rules, having all these outward signs. Only those people should be admitted to church membership. This is going to be a problem, and here's why. The Church of England enrolled all of the king's subjects, so every subject of the king in England was officially a member of the Church of England. It didn't matter if you actually attended or not, you were a member of the Church of England. The separatists felt like they were being forced to share churches with the damned, people who were going to hell. And they believed that those people are going to corrupt their children and just ruin everything. So, while the Puritans wanted to purify or fix the church, the separatists take it a step further and they decide they need a 100% split from the Church of England, and they don't even want to be with the other Puritans. They want to be totally on their own. They want to make their own separatist utopia where everybody will follow all the rules, believe the Bible, and be good Christians. So, the separatists started their own separate church in England, which was illegal. You weren't allowed to start other churches besides the Church of England. That was the only legal church in England. Well, slight problem if you've started an illegal church. It's not really a good time in history to do that. And that leads us to the danger of being a separatist. There was no separation between church and state in England at that time. Here in the United States, we famously have that separation of church and state, so the government can't force you to go to church or belong to one church. They can't favor one church over the others. England didn't have that. If you were English, you belonged to the Church of England, and that's what you needed to believe. And maybe privately in your own head you didn't, but you didn't say that out loud. So, if you wanted to separate from the Church of England, that was considered treason. And this is not a good time in history to commit treason. The king at the time, James I, dealt very harshly with treason, and he was quite paranoid, particularly because very early in his reign, in 1605, there was the gunpowder plot. The gunpowder plot was where a group of Catholic extremists led by Guy Fawkes, intended to blow up both the king and Parliament. Fortunately, the plot didn't succeed, but it made the king super paranoid, and he was very worried that at any moment someone was going to try to assassinate him. And there was still a lot of tension in England about the fact that Catholics wanted to regain control, the Protestants were currently holding control in the form of the Church of England. But the Church of England was really similar to the Catholic Church, so it was kind of hard for common people to honestly tell the difference. Lots of tension. And so we move forward. Let's talk about Plymouth. Plymouth Colony is going to be settled by the separatists and non-separatists, referred to as strangers, which tells you how friendly the separatists were to non-separatists. So Plymouth Colony was founded in 1620, but it only lasted until 1686. 66 years, that's it. This, my friends, is the Pilgrims. So every Thanksgiving, we trot these people out. You've probably made a little pilgrim when you were in elementary school. If you have kids, they probably come home talking about the Pilgrims in November. Pilgrims only lasted for 66 years. They are a very, very small part of the story of American history. So why on earth does Plymouth matter so much to American identity, especially when we look at what these separatists were actually like? Because they're very different from us today. So why are we so obsessed with the Pilgrims, aka the separatists? That's a little thought you can ponder in the back of your mind as we're learning. So back to James. All right, so we're in Britain, 1606. King James I realizes that Britain needs a permanent settlement in New England. He also wants a permanent settlement further down. You may remember this from our last lesson. He granted competing royal charters to the Plymouth Company and the Virginia Company of London, aka the London Company. So remember that one of these is going to go on to found Jamestown, while the other is going to found Plymouth eventually. So 1606, he gives the charters. Those two companies are what are known as joint stock companies. It's a good term to know. So joint stock companies were companies made up of shareholders. Shareholders would invest their money in the company in exchange for a share of the company's profits. That's where they get the word shareholder. Now, in the 1600s, joint stock companies formed specifically for exploring and colonizing in the New World. So these private investors would invest money in the company to send a group of people to start a colony or to send a group of people to go exploring. And then any profit that that voyage or that colony made, they would get to share in. Now, you can probably already see, if you remember back to the experience with Roanoke and the experience with Jamestown at the beginning, there's a lot of financial risk associated with this. So, the English crown, in other words, the king, is very tight on money right then. The treasury had spent a lot on war with Spain the previous century. They'd lost money on Roanoke. So they were reluctant to invest a significant amount of treasury money in overseas exploration and colonization. Again, it's a very risky investment because it could go terribly wrong. You don't know for sure that a colony is going to succeed. So James I wants colonies, but he doesn't want to have to spend his own money on it or the treasury's money. So he would give charters to joint stock companies. That way, private investors would assume the financial risk. Potentially, they would get well paid in return, so they're happy. And the crown, meanwhile, gets all the benefits of colonies without the financial risk. Pretty smart, right? So the Virginia Company of London, or the London Company, ends up establishing Jamestown the following year. And as we remember from the last lesson, Jamestown was a magnificent failure initially, and then eventually they managed to make it profitable with some significant reforms. The Plymouth Company, meanwhile, had set out right around the same time as the London Company, but their first attempt was a massive failure, so much so that we don't even need to talk about it. But a little bit later, they established Plymouth in 1620. And that is kind of successful. Actually, not very successful. So you may remember this map also from the last lesson. Each company had established territory, plus there was the shared overlapping area where they could both establish settlements as long as the settlements were at least 100 miles apart. So the Virginia Company controls basically what later becomes Virginia and Maryland. And then there's this overlap, and the Plymouth Company is up in New England. 1607, as we mentioned, the London Company established Jamestown. Now, the Plymouth Company established Popham right a little bit later, and Popham Colony fails. That's way up near Maine. So, meanwhile, this is going on with the king and the joint stock companies. Meanwhile, what's going on with the separatists? The separatists have decided to leave England. So in 1608, just a year after Jamestown, the entire congregation of about 400 people from the village of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, leaves England and moves to Leyden, which is in Holland, the Netherlands. The reason they left is because their church was illegal, so technically they are all guilty of treason. King James I is very upset about their existence. They decide it's a really good time to leave. You can actually see in the photo their original church that they had founded in England. So they go to the Netherlands because the Netherlands were enjoying quite a bit of religious freedom. So nobody in the Netherlands is really going to care if they start their own church. And there were actually some financial incentives for going. Now, the one problem is they had to leave behind a lot of their property and things in England. So some of this congregation had actually been relatively wealthy, and then they go to the Netherlands and they have to basically do menial labor. That wasn't super pleasant for them. Now, they refer to themselves as saints, not pilgrims, which is what we call them today. Fact is, if they were alive today, they would probably prefer that you still call them saints. They found religious freedom, as promised, in Holland, but they were also worried about how secular Holland was. See, Holland, the Netherlands, were enjoying a great deal of wealth right then in history, and with that, an explosion in the arts and culture and in the sciences, and that takes people's attention away from religion oftentimes. So William Bradford, one of the leaders, said that the young people were drawn away by evil example into extravagance and dangerous courses. That's a direct quote from him. Then another problem emerges. England forms an alliance with Holland against the Spanish specifically, and that includes outlawing independent English churches in Holland. So Holland agrees they won't allow such churches anymore, which makes England happy. But that means that once again, this group of people from Scrooby are in violation of the law. So at this point, they decide they're going to move again, this time to a place without government interference, no worldly distractions. They're going to the New World, specifically Virginia. So 1620, it's time to leave again. They arrange to travel to the New World aboard two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. Not everyone could go right then, so they decide they're going to send mainly the youngest and strongest from their congregation to establish the new colony. Quite a few people couldn't afford to go right then. There were other people where there was just too much that they needed to untangle before they would be able to leave, and this is moving really fast. So again, the youngest and strongest are going to go. The rest are hopefully going to follow later. That's the plan. So what specifically was the plan? The Speedwell and the Mayflower are going to leave at the beginning of August or possibly even in July of 1620. Therefore, the ships will arrive in Virginia in October, and they negotiated with the Virginia Company to be allowed to settle in its jurisdiction. The Virginia Company agreed to this, so they have legal right to settle. And again, later the rest of the congregation will join them. That's the plan. But the Speedwell had a leak. So the Speedwell ended up unable to make the voyage. Instead, everybody had to go on board the Mayflower. The Mayflower was bigger than the Speedwell, but it's really not that big of a ship. It was about 80 to 90 feet long on deck, about 100 to 110 feet long overall. So imagine being on something that size with over 100 people for a few months. It was originally a merchant ship, so it's built accordingly. This is what it would have looked like if you looked at a cross section of the ship. You can see the people would live on the upper decks and then this one interior deck. And then you'd have a lot of storage. Most of your space is going to be used, in fact, for storage. So the Mayflower set sail with 102 passengers. Only half of them were actually separatists. They didn't have enough money to fully finance this voyage, and the Virginia Company was not willing to allow just separatists to start a colony. So half of the people are separatists, or possibly a little bit less than half. The rest are what they called strangers, and then they also have 30 crew to run the ship. The non-separatists included Miles Standish. You may have heard that name maybe when you were in elementary school talking about the first Thanksgiving. They like to bring him up. He was the military advisor for Plymouth Colony. And as I mentioned, the separatists referred to the others on board as strangers, which is just so friendly of them, isn't it? Now, unfortunately, they sailed off course and they accidentally landed in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. That is not Virginia. So they were way outside the domain of the Virginia Company, which means they accidentally became squatters without legal right to the land they were on, and they had no authority to establish a government. That part of the story sometimes gets left out. So if you look on this map, in the red you can see the Gulf Stream current, which is part of the reason they ended up off course. In the solid line that's gray, that's the planned route of the Mayflower, where they were supposed to land in Virginia. But that dotted line is what actually happened. And of course, they ended up in the wrong spot. So a little bit about the voyage. The planned departure was July, August of 1620. The Mayflower and the Speedwell did set out, but the Speedwell discovered that leak and they had to return twice. In fact, one time they got 350 miles out to sea and then had to come back because the Speedwell was leaking. The reason it leaked, interestingly, they had added a second mast to the ship, and apparently the mast they put on it was too big. So many historians believe it's an oversized mast that caused the leak, but there's some other accounts that propose other solutions for why it had a leak. So September 6th is when the Mayflower finally set sail again alone. You can see they're setting sail over a month late. Because of the delay, they end up crossing the Atlantic at the height of storm season. So the journey is absolutely horrible. The people were miserable. Then they arrived November 11th, 66 days at sea. And remember, it's stormy and choppy water, thoroughly unpleasant, and that is not a very big ship. So yeah, about little over 2 months at sea. When they arrived, they found an abandoned Indian village and not much else. They also realized at that point that they are totally in the wrong place. This is roughly what the area where they landed would have looked like. They did not land at Plymouth Rock. That came later. Somebody decided that that was going to be the rock where they supposedly landed. It's an American myth. Here's roughly like the type of dwelling that they would have found in the abandoned Indian dwelling. And so one of the ways that they fed themselves was they actually dug up some Indian burials where they had buried supplies with their lost loved ones. And of course, grave robbing is not really going to be taken favorably by Native Americans or by anyone. So they're in a scary situation. Remember, they have no right to be in Massachusetts at all. The king has not given them a charter. They don't have permission from the king, and you have to have permission from the king. And they don't have permission from the Plymouth Company to settle there. Their permission, their deal was with the Virginia Company. So here they are on land with no legal rights whatsoever, and they're already basically treasonous and have been persecuted for it. So they're in a scary situation. In order to immediately establish themselves as a legitimate colony, they draft and sign the Mayflower Compact. So it's basically like an early constitution. They decide they're going to name their colony Plymouth, which is the English port that they had departed from. So 41 of the saints and strangers draft and sign this Mayflower Compact, which I'll show you a picture of in just a second. The compact promised to create a civil body politique governed by elected officials and just and equal laws. And they also very, very clearly swear allegiance to the English king. These are not fools. So this is roughly what the Mayflower Compact would have looked like. Now, the problem that they face besides this is that it's November. It's New England. If you've ever been to New England in November, it's cold. You can't grow anything right then. And they don't have any dwellings, so everybody lived on ship for the first few weeks. They sailed up the coast to Plymouth. Plymouth was a little bit further from where they actually landed. And so they find a good spot. They start to build their town. There was a group of Wampanoag people who had lived there before and had died from sickness. So there's a little bit of existing structure there. Here again, they rob graves to feed themselves. And they continue to live on the Mayflower for months. They row ashore to build houses during the day, and then they return to the ship at night because they're very exposed. They have no protection from the elements or from the natives. So it's not until March of 1621 that they finally had enough houses that everybody could live on land. So to refresh your memory, they arrive in November. It's not till March that they're actually in a land-based colony. They spent all those months further on that tiny ship. And this is roughly what their colony would have looked like once they got it built. Here's another view. This is the reconstructed settlement that you can visit today. Definitely worth a visit if you're ever in New England. So we need to return to a little bit more talk about theology, because it's very important what these people believed. The Separatists believed in covenant theology. The Puritans also believed this. So both colonies, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, which we'll talk about in a little bit, they both believe in basically the same theological idea. They believe that they exist in a series of covenants. Covenants are basically like legally binding contracts, you could think of them. Most importantly is the covenant of grace. So it is a binding agreement between the separatist communities and God. Their idea is that they have this binding contract with God that if they do the right thing, he will bless their colony. If they do the wrong thing, he will curse their colony. So in order to keep the blessing of God, it's very important that they keep their colony on the straight and narrow, obey the rules, be good people. But you can probably see where that might make them a bit intolerant of other people because there'd be a bit of fear associated with this theology. They also believed in the social covenant. The social covenant was between members of the separatist communities with each other. So all of the separatists believe that they have basically a legally binding agreement with one another, that you have to watch one another to make sure that everybody falls in line and exists on this straight and narrow path. There's no toleration of deviance or disorder because one person acting inappropriately could bring down our whole colony. So it's not just a matter of they want everyone to believe a certain way and behave a certain way. They actually feel like they have to, that their very existence depends on it. It's an existential threat if people don't follow the rules. And so, because of all this diligence, there is absolutely no privacy. They are in one another's business constantly, and they believe that that's the correct way to live. So what was their first year like in Plymouth? That first winter of 1620 to 1621 was not a nice winter. So if you think back to Jamestown, you probably remember Jamestown had that really rough first winter also, where a lot of people died. Plymouth is the same way. Only 44 out of the original 102 people survived. They had a horrible starvation winter. But in 1621, when the Mayflower left and went back to England, nobody chose to leave. They had the option. Survival of the colony 100% depended on aid from the Native Americans. It's the only way they would have survived. So the Wampanoag Confederation, which is a group of allied Native American tribes or nations, they helped the Pilgrims, as we call them, stay alive. And that's why in the fall of 1621, they celebrated the first Thanksgiving, probably in October, not November. It was basically a harvest festival and a feast to celebrate the fact that they were still alive, to thank the Native Americans for helping them, and most importantly in their minds, to thank God for sparing their lives. The colony then continued to survive economically by getting involved in the fur trade, especially beavers, also fishing and lumber. Their leader was William Bradford, who we already mentioned. William Bradford was a self-taught scholar. This is the house where he was born back in England. He was the chosen governor of Plymouth 30 times. They held a yearly election. Every year he was elected. So he helped draft the Plymouth Legal Code, and he facilitated the community centered on private subsistence agriculture and religious tolerance. Now, they claimed religious tolerance. They didn't actually practice religious tolerance. Then in 1630, he began to compile his 2-volume set of Plymouth Plantation, which is one of the most important early chronicles of settlement in New England. Great big long 2-volume book, and it explains the mindset, what they were thinking, what happened. It's a very good historical source. It's one of the reasons why we know as much as we do about what happened. Now, there's also some other important people that played a role. Samoset is one of them. He was an Abenaki, which is an Algonquin-speaking tribe, chief. He was the first Native American to encounter the Plymouth settlers in March of 1621. He greeted them in English, asked for beer, and arranged some early trades. He also introduced them to Squanto, who will become another important ally. So Squanto came from the Patuxet tribe. He was the sole survivor of his tribe. They were wiped out. He became a key liaison between native populations in southern New England and the Mayflower settlers. He learned English because he had been kidnapped by the English when he was younger and ended up living in Europe for 5 years. So he actually did a fair amount of world traveling. He acted as a translator, guide, and advisor to Plymouth during the 20 months that he lived directly with them. He was incredibly helpful to them, incredibly wise. They owed their survival to this man. He's the one that showed them how to sow and fertilize native crops, because one of the problems in Plymouth was a lot of these people were not farmers. And even those who were farmers had never farmed in the New World. They knew how to farm in England. So he had to show them how this land is different. The soil doesn't work the same way you're used to. The crops are different. Here's how we handle this. He's also the one that introduced them to the fur trade, which is basically their economic salvation. It gives them a way to make a profit. One other important Native American was Massasoit. He was the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. He was a very good leader. He's known for his honesty, his diplomacy, peacemaking, and he is also responsible for preventing the failure of Plymouth Colony. In exchange for military aid against the Narragansett tribe, who were an enemy tribe, Massasoit offered to help the Plymouth settlers by teaching them to feed themselves. You can imagine he's just thinking, oh, these poor white people, you are not going to make it. All right, fine, I'll help you. So once the treaty was agreed to, Massasoit ordered Squanto to teach the colonists everything they needed to know to survive. That's why Squanto came and lived with them for 20 months. They taught them farming in that region, nut and berry gathering, and fishing. And so that led to the Pilgrim-Wampanoag Peace Treaty, which was signed April 1st of 1621, just less than a month after they got into their homes. It's the first treaty between a Native American tribe and a group of American colonists. According to the treaty, if a Wampanoag broke the peace, he would be sent to Plymouth for punishment. They would be allowed to choose his punishment. If a colonist broke the law, he would be sent to the Wampanoags to be punished. So, very fair system of justice. And this peace treaty lasted for over 50 years. So early American history owes a lot to the Wampanoag people. Over time, Plymouth Colony establishes further towns and cities. You can see all these different settlements crop up. Now their government was a little bit unique. So originally it ran as a charter government despite lacking a charter from the British government. They treated that Mayflower Compact as basically their contract with the king, even though the king had not agreed to this. The sole permission Plymouth Colony had to establish itself in North America was a land patent issued by the New England Consul in 1621, but it did not give them the legal right to pass and establish laws in their own colony. So they never had legal security. They tried for many decades to obtain a charter from the British government, but they never succeeded. Part of the reason was they weren't economically important enough for the king to care about. There's also the issue that the king didn't like separatists, and separatists are running the colony, so you can see where he wouldn't be favorable towards them. So eventually they lost the right to self-govern entirely, and they were forced to merge with Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691, and thus ends the Pilgrims. As I said, they're a very short part of American history. Now, the way their economy worked is based on fish, timber, fur, and agriculture. The colonists would send back goods that they harvested on ships for the Plymouth Company to sell in England at a profit. But they struggled for many years to make money, and they were deeply in debt to their investors, the Plymouth Colony, which remember is a joint stock colony. So you've got stockholders that are getting increasingly irritated because they're not making a profit. They're the ones who paid for the voyage. They're the ones that gave the startup money for the colony. The colonists eventually bought out the investors when the investors became unhappy with the lack of return they saw from their investment. And that bought Plymouth some time, but ultimately Plymouth stayed small and economically unimportant. By 1691, there were only 7,000 people in the entire colony. Even with all those individual settlements, only 7,000 people. So now, let's turn our attention to Massachusetts Bay, which is settled by the Puritans, who, remember, have very similar theological beliefs, but they're not as strict as the separatists. So if you look at the map in green, this shows you how far white settlement had gotten by 1674. If you look down on this little bit that juts out, you can see where Plymouth is. Massachusetts Bay was further up. So, the Puritans leave England. 1629. They received a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. So, right off the bat, there's a big difference between them and the separatists. These guys have a legal right to settle the land that they're actually going to land in. Their motive is to escape conflict and persecution by conservatives in the Church of England who don't want the Church of England to change. Because remember, the Puritans want to purify the church. They don't want to leave it, they just want to leave what they see as impurities within the church. So 1630, a year later, 1,000 people set off in 11 well-stocked ships. Well, that's a huge difference between what we've seen so far in colonies. They establish a colony with Boston as its hub, and this leads to the Great Migration of the 1630s. There was turmoil in England, which eventually leads to a civil war in England, and that sends about 70,000 Puritans to America, 20,000 of whom went to Massachusetts Bay. So not only did they set off with way more people and way more supplies, they also got fed further people throughout the 1630s, which is what a colony really needs to get off the ground and thrive. They had quite a few advantages over Plymouth. Unlike the Plymouth settlers, they had 11 ships versus 1, although it had originally been 2. They were well stocked. The Mayflower folks packed about as intelligently as the Jamestown folks. One man packed 100 pairs of shoes on the Mayflower. This will never cease to make me laugh. 100 pairs of shoes to go to a new world where you're going to basically build a colony from the ground up. Oh boy. Unlike Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay colonists landed where they intended to. They also came at a much better time of year. They arrived in June instead of November. I mean, what's with these English always settling in the fall and the winter? Terrible strategy. It's much smarter to come in the summer. They also arrived at an existing settlement, Salem, so it couldn't accommodate them, but there were already people in Salem. They were able to give them advice, guidance, and warnings about the Narragansett tribe, who again were not friendly. Massachusetts Bay was also far more independent than other colonies because of the fact that it had a much better beginning. But it did have some disadvantages. The biggest disadvantage was they struggled to find sources of fresh water. It was a huge early problem for them. They also were very intolerant towards non-Puritans, especially Anglicans, Quakers, and Baptists, which will become a big source of problems later. They also had growing problems with their Native American neighbors. And the problem was this little thing known as disease. By 1650, about 90% of the Native Americans living in New England had died. 1650. The white people have been there for 30 years. 30 years to accidentally kill 90% of the people due to diseases that they just have never experienced before. So the remaining 10% are very resentful. I think we would agree, probably justifiably resentful. The leader in Massachusetts Bay is a man named John Winthrop. He was a very well-off attorney and manor lord in England, part of the landed gentry. He was the writer of A Model of Christian Charity, which is sometimes known as City Upon a Hill. You may have heard of this before. Might ring a little bit of a bell. This was actually a sermon that he preached that instructed people on how to live in their new colony. When he talked about a city on a hill, it was an allusion to a passage from the Bible. But in ancient times, a city on a hill typically refers to a fortification for defense. His idea was, we are exposed. The eyes of the world are upon us. We have the threat of possible enemies, but we also have people watching to see if we succeed or fail. And we have to keep that in mind. Basically, we need to get things right. And so here's all the ways that we need to live in order to get things right. About 300 years later, somebody discovered this document, completely misinterpreted it, and you've heard it misinterpreted ever since in presidential speeches. A lot of American presidents like to mention City Upon a Hill. They nearly always get the original meaning wrong. So John Winthrop becomes the first governor of Massachusetts. He believed that he had a calling from God to lead there. And he served as the governor or deputy governor for 19 years. So didn't serve quite as long as John Bradford. The government and economy in Massachusetts Bay. This was the most successful and profitable colony in New England. Because it was a charter colony, the administration of the colony was elected by the colonists, and the colony was allowed to self-govern as long as its laws aligned with those of England. So that gave them quite a bit of freedom for how they wanted to set things up. Now, there was an interesting little problem with the paperwork. When the charter was issued, it neglected to say that joint stock company members had to stay in England to conduct their meetings. So they ended up moving the entire company to New England in order to have more self-governance. And that whole decision is based on the fact that something that should have been in the contract got left out by accident. So they're like, hey, win-win. Economically, very successful. They engaged in trade with England, Mexico, and the West Indies. So they were way better off than Plymouth. And again, you can see the spread of New England, how you eventually get Rhode Island, you get Connecticut. New Haven was like separate from actual Connecticut. Later, they'll get joined. By 1650, this is what New England looks like. You can see off to the side is New France. Some of that land the English will later get hold of. Now let's look at New England compared to Chesapeake. So in other words, Jamestown and Maryland. If you look at the orange, that shows you where the settled areas are. You can see New England became much more settled and had a much larger population. Now you can also see in the little chart the male life expectancy at age 20 in the 17th century. So how long a 20-year-old could expect to live. In England, a 20-year-old could expect he would probably live to be about 55 years old. In Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, he had a much shorter life expectancy. But in New England, look at how much longer the life expectancy was, because New England became much, much healthier. Here's a little bit about what their life was like. So again, much healthier than Virginia. Their life expectancy was 70 years. They had many extended families, so multiple generations would settle in the same area. On average, there were 6 children per family. Average age at marriage, take a guess. What are you thinking? You're probably thinking too young. A lot of people, when I ask this question, they think that women must have been teenagers, but actually, on average, women didn't get married till they were 22 and men were 27. See, they would wait to marry until they were financially able. Now, here's a couple interesting statistics about New England life, just to draw you a more vivid picture. The estimated number of sermons the average Puritan or separatist listened to in their lifetime, 7,000. The average length of each of those sermons, over 2 hours apiece. We're talking well over 14,000 hours of your life spent listening to sermons. What were the holidays like? They featured more sermons and they were longer. You can see these people were very committed to their religious beliefs. This is what a typical New England town looked like. And take a look at what was going on with their population. So the white population is the blue line, and you can see there was an explosion of population as you got into the 1700s. So their colony is thriving. People are having babies. Enough of those babies are surviving infancy and growing up to have families of their own. Another interesting line to look at is that red line, which represents Black people within the colony. And you'll see that it stays at about 0, and then it comes up just a tiny bit when you get into close to 1750. Well, the reason is New England didn't base its economy on slavery the way that Virginia and Maryland had. New England did not grow a major cash crop like tobacco that would lead people to want a cheap source of labor. So slavery did not really take off. And in fact, that very small Black population that you have is largely made up of free Blacks, and then there's also Black servants. There are a few slaves for people that moved to New England, but slavery, again, is not really a big thing in New England. And then, sadly, in the green line, you see the Native American population, which just collapses. And it's largely accidental, it's because disease. So, a bit more about life in New England. The English colonists in North America in 1625 totaled 2,000. Let's look at what happened by 1700, 75 years later. 250,000. 50 years later, there's over 1 million. So remember, we saw the population was really exploding when you got into the 1700s. The population was actually doubling every 25 years. So they had a very healthy growth happening. This is a statistic that I find very interesting. The percentage of time women aged 20 to 40 were either pregnant or nursing, 50% of their time during that 20-year period of their lives. Oof. And the percentage of all known witchcraft executions in North America that took place in New England, 90%. That also tells you a little bit more about New England. New England had that slight problem with witchcraft mania that took off in the 1600s. Well, it wasn't all fun and games. There was the problem of more Indian wars. So one of the earliest Indian wars in New England was the Pequot Wars. Basically lasted a little over a year. Most of it happened in 1637. The Pequots were a very powerful tribe in the Connecticut River Valley. You've probably never heard of them, and the reason why is because of this war. It started when a group of white settlers with some Narragansett allies, which is interesting because remember before they were fighting the Narragansetts. Now they've allied together, and they attacked a Pequot village. They set fire to the homes and they shot fleeing survivors, which naturally led to an outright war with the Pequot people. And the result was that tribe was virtually annihilated. Pretty much no longer existed at the end of this war. If you look on that little map, you can see the route that the war took. Eventually, this led to a very uneasy peace for 40 years, followed by King Philip's War. So after the Pequot War, it kind of shattered the innocence, you could say. There were a lot of subsequent Native American attacks on English settlements, English attacks on Native American villages, and it all comes to a head in King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676. Native Americans came to believe that their only hope for resistance against the white settlers and the resulting death and loss of land was to unite with one another and face off against the English. So King Philip's War was the Native Americans' last major effort to drive English colonists out of New England and restore their homeland. The war was the single greatest disaster of 17th century New England, and in proportion to population, it's actually the deadliest war in American history when you consider what proportion of the population died. Metacom, who was known as King Philip to the white settlers, was Massasoit's son. He became leader of that tribe, the Wampanoags. Metacom, aka King Philip, united the Native Americans and began staging coordinated attacks on white settlements throughout New England. However, the unity was very precarious. A lot of these Native American tribes had been enemies in the past, so they didn't trust one another, and as a result, they sometimes attacked each other. They weren't fully united. The frontier settlements of white people were forced to retreat to Boston. This is a woodcutting depicting part of this war. And as you can see, the white people technically have superior technology, the musket, but I would add the caveat that the muskets were notoriously hard to aim. They were about as dangerous to the person shooting them as they were to the person getting shot, whereas a bow and arrow can be reloaded and shot very quickly and very accurately. So the technological advantage is not quite as great as you would think. On this map, you can see the English settlements that were attacked, and you can see where the Native American settlements and tribes were. It was just a chaotic mess. This is a bust depicting what King Philip or Metacom probably looked like. And the war ended in failure for the Indians. Metacom was beheaded and drawn and quartered. This was a type of punishment that had existed in England since the 1500s. Usually it was hanging and then drawn and quartered. With him, they beheaded and drawn and quartered. What that drawn and quartered means is they would actually cut the body into pieces. So they would cut off the arms, the legs, the head, and then you'd have the body separate. And then sometimes they would display the pieces or send them to different places. It was a very humiliating death and honestly a bit of overkill. But this was commonly done to serious convicts, and so that's how King Philip is treated, or Metacom is treated. Additionally, his wife and his son were sold into slavery. After this, Indians were never again a serious threat in New England. Their numbers had been decimated, they never had the unity, and their one last-ditch attempt had been such a spectacular failure for them. Another problem in New England was the issue of dissidents, or people that don't want to go along with the status quo. There was a major controversy known as the Antinomian controversy. Great word, antinomian. Antinomian literally means against the law. This was a theological divide, and it nearly destroyed Massachusetts Bay. It largely started because of one woman, Anne Hutchison, who we'll talk more about in a second. The main issues were an argument of free grace versus works for salvation, so a theological issue. Some people were saying that grace from God was freely given if you just asked for it, and therefore you could attain salvation. Other people said that you needed to do good works, or that good works were evidence that you were saved, and there was a huge argument on those 2 points of view. There was also the issue of focusing on the inner self rather than the outward appearances of righteousness. So Puritans and separatists tended to focus on the outward appearances a lot of times because they believed that you needed to see these signs from people to know that they were part of the elect. The people who were going against them theology-wise believed that you should work on your own self in your heart, your motivations. You should make those pure. Your morals and values should come from within. You don't need to prove it, though that's going to follow naturally once the inside of you is right. There was also the issue of direct revelation becoming equal to the Bible in validity. And this was another big controversy. So Anne Hutchison claimed eventually that she was a prophetess and that she was getting ideas directly from God that were what God wanted, and that these ideas were equal to the Bible in validity. That, in other words, they should be followed just like the Bible. And of course, the Puritans did not like that. So Anne Hutchison was a Puritan spiritual advisor, a religious reformer, and a midwife. She basically started out as a very well-respected woman within the community. She had, I believe, 20 kids, married a long time, and she started a women's Bible study out of her home, and that was totally fine. She believed that there was a mandate from God that the older women should teach the younger women. That is actually found in the Bible, so I mean, it was a biblical argument to be making, and she was teaching the women. The problem was she was a really good public speaker and a really good teacher. She knew her Bible well, and she was telling people things that were giving them confidence of their salvation, because she was teaching them that they could know that they were saved, that they didn't have to constantly worry about proving it. And that was enabling the women to really relax mentally. it drew in the men as a result. So men started attending these Bible studies, and they are also feeling reassured by her words. Well, that puts her in conflict with the leaders. The Puritans were very strict on the fact that women could not instruct men. She also began accusing the local ministers of preaching a covenant of works rather than a covenant of grace. She went after them for their theology and used the Bible to attack them. Not really a great strategy if you want to stay in the colony. So she was eventually tried and convicted, and it was not a fair trial by any means. Her trial, there's actually transcripts of that you can find online to read. They're almost humorous because these men are just freaking out about this woman. To our modern mindset, it's funny as all get out. And she's just answering them straightly and securely and really not getting ruffled at all. So after this basically sham trial, they banish her from the colony and they banished anyone who agreed with her. So she ends up going to Rhode Island to be with, well, her and her husband, to be with this guy, Roger Williams, who also got banished. Roger Williams was a Puritan separatist minister, a theologian, and an author. He founded Providence Plantations, which eventually became the colony of Rhode Island. And it was a haven for Baptists because the Puritans hated Baptists and persecuted them because they disagree theologically. So Roger Williams was kicked out of Massachusetts Bay, and he starts Providence Plantations, where he's later joined by Anne Hutchison and her husband and a lot of her family. Roger Williams is an interesting guy in American history. He was a staunch advocate for religious freedom. He advocated for the separation of church and state. He advocated for fair dealings with the Native Americans. His colony got on well with the Native Americans. He was also one of the first abolitionists. He believed slavery was absolutely wrong and anti-Christian, that you couldn't be a good Christian and own slaves. So, as I mentioned, he was expelled from Massachusetts Bay for his dangerous views. And there we will leave Massachusetts Bay, and we'll pick up with some more colonies in the next lesson.